1873, Massachusetts, the Cartwright twins, the case science refuses to study. In the autumn of 1873, two identical women walked into the Haverford Institute of Medicine, a newly established private facility in Massachusetts, seeking treatment for what they described as a disorder of the soul. Within 4 months, the fates of both Clara and Beatrice Cartwright would be sealed. One descended into a frantic rage, destroying furniture and screaming nonsensically until her voice was hoarse and she collapsed from exhaustion. The other was discovered in a state of absolute stillness, her wide, vacant eyes staring into an unseen distance, her body slowly fading like a candle about to be extinguished. The attending physician, Dr. Edwin Marrow, claimed their tragedy was due to the onset of a hereditary nervous prostration. But when a dedicated nurse and a curious journalist tried to uncover the truth, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. Every medical record related to the sisters had been systematically altered, falsified, or had vanished in ways that suggested a deliberate cover-up, not mere negligence. Dr. Marrow himself left town abruptly shortly after the tragedy, leaving behind only pages of detailed experimental notes written in a complex system of symbols that no one could decipher. What those notes concealed about human experimentation would force the town's medical community to make a fateful choice: expose the truth and risk destroying public trust in modern medicine, or bury it forever to protect the Institute's reputation and their own careers. They chose silence. But silence has a way of rotting from within, and the truth about what happened to the Cartwright sisters has been festering in the shadows of New England medical history for nearly 150 years, waiting for someone brave enough to turn over the pages that were destined to be forgotten. To understand what drove two young, intelligent women to seek medical help that would ultimately lead them down a path of destruction in the most horrific ways, we need to go back to where it all began, a prosperous textile town on the banks of the Connecticut River, where the Cartwright family had built their empire on the whirring of machinery and the sweat of laborers, and where the dark secrets of the elite were carefully hidden behind the red brick walls of the factories. The Haverford Institute of Medicine was situated on a hill overlooking the town, its Gothic architecture both imposing and intimidating. It was promoted as the most advanced medical facility in the region, a symbol of the town's prosperity. But Nathaniel Cartwright, the sisters' father, sought out the institute for more than just its reputation. He had heard of Dr. Marrow's breakthrough methods, and he believed his wealth could buy peace for his suffering daughters, never knowing he was paying for something far more dangerous than the illness they carried. Healthy bodies for drug trials, brains for study, and sometimes, when the contribution was generous enough, living patients for what Dr. Marrow called advanced behavioral therapy. It all began quite reasonably. When poor, unclaimed patients died at the institute, their bodies were often used for anatomy classes. Dr. Edwin Marrow paid a handsome sum to the institute for each specimen preserved in good condition, a significant income that helped cover the institute's costs. But $20 per body became $50 when Marrow began requesting special cases, those with rare neurological disorders. He had perfected techniques for preserving brain tissue that he had learned from a controversial German scientist who had been expelled from Berlin for unethical experiments. Soon, Marrow was no longer just waiting for unfortunate patients to pass away. Those admitted with complex psychological symptoms, those without powerful families to ask questions, or those who were simply too frail to resist experimental treatment protocols, often never left Haverford. Their deaths were explained away as unforeseen complications, and medical records were skillfully adjusted to fit the narrative. In reality, their minds and bodies were serving Marrow's ambition, providing him with invaluable data that no laboratory could offer. Clara and Beatrice Cartwright, born on a clear June afternoon in 1845, amidst the rhythmic clatter of their family's looms, were identical twins who grew up in a world of wealth and heavy expectations. By 1873, both were 28 years old, possessing the slender build of upper-class women accustomed to a life of ease. They shared the same lustrous blonde hair and deep green eyes, but those eyes reflected two entirely different worlds. Clara's eyes were sharp and analytical, while Beatrice's were dreamy, as if gazing into some invisible realm. Clara, The elder sister, by 12 minutes, had always been the more forceful and decisive. As a child, she was fascinated by her father's chemistry lab, tinkering with compounds with scientific precision. She had a sharp intellect and an iron will, never hesitating to confront anyone who stood in her way. Her anger, when it flared, was like an explosive chemical reaction, intense, hot, but always with a cold logic behind it. She approached problems the way her father approached business, methodically, efficiently, and always with an eye on the end result. Beatrice, born as the last rays of the afternoon sun gilded the river, possessed an ethereal stillness that most people found more perplexing than her sister's assertiveness. Where Clara would confront with sharp arguments, Beatrice would simply fall silent, looking with her deep green eyes until the other person felt as if their every thought was laid bare. She had learned early on that silence could be more powerful than words, that an unspoken understanding carried more weight than any grand pronouncement. The sisters were educated at home by the finest tutors, as was customary for wealthy industrialist families, but their education followed very different paths. Nathaniel, obsessed with what he called industrial innovation and the practical application of science, had unwittingly encouraged his two daughters to pursue their distinct interests from a young age. By their teens, Clara had her own small chemistry lab, while Beatrice had read through the family's vast library, especially books on psychology and philosophy. Though not as brutal as the Hendersons, the sisters grew up in an environment where human value was often measured by productivity. They had watched their father dismiss workers injured in the factory without a second thought, replacing them like broken parts in a giant machine. They had seen his indifference to poor working conditions as long as the production lines kept running. From childhood, Clara and Beatrice had learned to see the world through two different lenses, one of efficiency and logic, the other of empathy and emotion, two sides of the same coin forged in the industrial fire. Haverford in 1873 was a town torn between the traditional Protestant ethics of New England and the bold scientific ambitions of the industrial age. The Haverford Institute of Medicine, established just a few years earlier, was quickly gaining a reputation as one of the most progressive facilities in the region. Progressive in the sense that it was willing to experiment with therapies that conservative hospitals in Boston deemed too radical or unproven. The institute occupied a majestic Gothic building on Prospect Hill. Its pointed spires and arched windows made it look more like a cathedral than a hospital. The building's design, with its long corridors and high ceilings, was meant to evoke a sense of the profundity and authority of medicine, a place where the mysteries of the human body and mind could be deciphered. The marble-floored corridors and spacious patient rooms suggested that a serious, noble work of healing was underway, a work that sometimes required absolute privacy and discretion. Dr. Edwin Marrow arrived in Haverford in the summer of 1872, carrying a glittering reputation from prestigious Boston hospitals and theories about neurology that he claimed could reshape the very nature of humanity. Marrow was a man in his late 32s, slender in build, with dark, meticulously groomed hair and sharp brown eyes that seemed to analyze every detail they observed. His hands were long and steady, moving with the confidence of someone who believed he could fix the most complex of machines. Marrow's theories centered on the belief that emotions, memories, and even personality were not products of the soul or free will, but rather electrical impulses and chemical reactions in the brain. They could be measured, manipulated, and even reprogrammed through the use of neurostimulants and hypnotic therapy. He had written several essays for specialized journals, arguing that the human mind was essentially a complex biological apparatus that could be fine-tuned like a Swiss watch. Most controversially, Marrow believed that identical twins offered a golden opportunity to test his theories under perfect conditions. Since they shared the same biological structure, any differences in their responses to therapies could be attributed directly to his interventions, not to genetic variables. One could serve as the baseline, while the other received the enhanced therapy, providing irrefutable proof of the power of his methods. These theories had made Marrow a divisive figure in Boston's medical circles. Older colleagues viewed his ideas as dangerous, arrogant, and potentially unethical. But in Haverford, where the board of directors, composed of industrialists hungry for innovation, Marrow found an ideal environment. The Haverford Institute of Medicine offered him the position of head of neurology, along with a state-of-the-art laboratory and a generous budget for clinical research. What the institute's board didn't know, or deliberately chose not to know, was that Marrow had been forced to leave his previous position in Boston after serious allegations emerged. It was rumored that he had conducted unauthorized hypnotic and chemical therapies on patients at a psychiatric asylum with catastrophic results. Although nothing was proven in court, whispers of several suspicious deaths followed him. The Boston medical community had skillfully pushed him out, wanting to avoid a scandal that could tarnish the reputation of the city's long-established medical institutions. The first sign that something was deeply wrong at the Cartwright mansion appeared on a damp September morning in 1873. Beatrice Cartwright was found by a maid in the family library, just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the thick fog enveloping the river. She was standing in the middle of the room, wearing only a thin nightgown, despite the early morning chill. Her porcelain skin was pale. Her hands hung limply at her sides, but her fingertips were stained with black ink, the thick kind used for her father's accounting ledgers, still wet enough to drip onto the expensive Persian rug. In her hand, she tightly clutched a quill pen, its nib broken, and clinging to it were several strands of deep red thread from her mother's favorite spool. Shallow scratches covered her forearms, as if she had raked her nails over a rough surface in a delirium. Her green eyes, usually so gentle and dreamy, now stared straight ahead with a frightening emptiness, suggesting she was not entirely present in the room. Nathaniel Cartwright, awakened by the maid's terrified shriek, found his daughter standing motionless, trembling slightly, as if an invisible cold wind were blowing through her. When asked what she was doing and why she was there, Beatrice could only whisper one phrase, over and over, in a distant, soulless voice. "The puppet strings have been cut. The puppet strings have been cut. The puppet strings have been cut." Clara, awakened by the commotion, ran downstairs and found her twin sister in this bizarre state. For the first time in her life, Clara felt a profound unease at her sister's actions. They had shared every secret, but Beatrice's current state suggested a psychological fracture that went far beyond ordinary grief. It didn't take long for Clara to find the source of the chaos. In their father's study, a strange and disturbing scene was laid out before her. 3 large porcelain dolls, their mother's prized collection, had been taken from their glass cabinet. They were seated neatly at Mr. Nathaniel's desk, facing the open ledgers. The dolls' hands were placed on the pages of the books, as if they were examining the numbers. But the most horrifying detail was that their glass eyes had been smeared with black ink, and the ink ran down their porcelain cheeks like black tears. The head of one doll had been shattered, the porcelain shards scattered on the floor, and next to it lay the spool of deep red thread Beatrice had held, a few strands clinging to the fragments. The scene had a morbidly ritualistic quality, rather than being a simple act of vandalism. These were the dolls their mother had loved most, mementos that both sisters had cherished. All 3 dolls had been deliberately damaged. The porcelain glaze on their faces was scratched and cracked, done with a sick meticulousness. The black ink had been carefully applied to their eyes, without smudging, suggesting the act was methodical, not frenzied. Each doll had been disfigured while the others watched, awaiting their turn. But their arrangement on the desk afterward required a level of bizarre planning that made the act even more disturbing. Someone had taken the time to position them precisely, adjusting their posture several times to create a silent, macabre tableau. Beatrice had no memory of damaging the dolls or arranging them afterward. When confronted with the physical evidence, the ink on her hands, the broken pen, and her clear presence in the library, she just stared blankly and insisted she had been in her bedroom all night. Her voice remained flat and distant, as if she were recounting a dream instead of an act of destruction. Clara, despite her strong protective instincts toward her sister, found herself deeply bewildered by Beatrice's complete indifference to the event. In the past, when they had gone through pain together, Beatrice had always shown her emotions deeply, whether through tears or a heavy silence. But now, she seemed completely disconnected from reality, as if the person who had committed this act was someone else entirely. Nathaniel Cartwright, more concerned with maintaining the family's perfect facade and avoiding gossip in high society than with understanding the root cause of his daughter's behavior, made a decision that would seal both their fates. Instead of seeking advice from the family doctor, who might ask uncomfortable questions, he decided his daughters needed a more intensive intervention. He explained to friends and business partners that his daughters were suffering from nervous prostration after the shock of their mother's death. He had the study cleaned and the damaged dolls put away, trying to erase all traces of the incident. To explain Beatrice's condition, the family claimed she had suffered a panic attack, and the scratches were from her harming herself in her confusion. But the incident had clearly awakened something in both sisters' minds. In the following days, Beatrice began to experience what she described as waking dreams. She would sit for hours staring out the window, occasionally pointing at falling leaves and whispering about spirits in conversation that only she could hear. Her sleep was fitful, disturbed by images she couldn't put into words. Meanwhile, Clara found herself tormented by a simmering, growing anger. She began having nightmares in which she saw herself smashing everything in her father's factory, feeling a sense of satisfaction as the machinery ground to a halt and silence fell. The dreams were so realistic that she often woke up with her hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms until they drew blood. More disturbingly, Clara began to feel a strange impulse, a desire to disrupt the order her family had built. The desire started as an intellectual curiosity about chaos. What would happen if a chemical formula was slightly altered? Could a small reaction cause a large explosion? Where were the limits of endurance? But the curiosity gradually evolved into a compulsion, a growing need to witness collapse with her own eyes. The twins, who had always shared a deep psychological understanding, seemed to be resonating with each other's instability in ways neither fully understood. Clara began spending more time in her lab, claiming she needed to focus on her work to forget her grief. Beatrice spent hours staring at her hands, believing they were stained with memories only she could feel, sometimes rubbing her fingers together obsessively until her skin was raw. As autumn gave way to the cold Massachusetts winter and the factory smokestacks began to belch thicker smoke into the gray sky, the psychological states of both Cartwright sisters continued down two opposing paths, as if orchestrated by an invisible hand. Clara's outbursts, once just sharp retorts, became more frequent and increasingly harsh. She would fly into a rage over trivial matters that had never bothered her before. A servant misplacing a book, a gardener pruning a rose bush incorrectly, even the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. During these moments, her words became as sharp as a scalpel, as if her anger was providing her with a vocabulary of vitriol she never normally used. At one dinner party, she publicly humiliated a business partner of her father's who had made the mistake of suggesting women should only concern themselves with domestic affairs. Clara responded with a cold, detailed analysis of the inefficiency in his factories, exposing his managerial flaws in front of everyone. The verbal assault was so intense and precise that Nathaniel and the other guests were left speechless, unable to interrupt her ruthless intellectual attack. Beatrice's condition evolved in the opposite direction, but with equal speed and intensity. While her sister grew sharper, Beatrice became more and more ethereal, as if she was slowly dissolving from the physical world into an internal space no one else could touch. She began to speak only in whispers when questioned, and her answers became increasingly metaphorical and incomprehensible. The maids reported finding Beatrice in strange places in the house, always sitting or standing completely still, as if she had been placed there like a statue and forgotten. They would discover her at dawn in the winter garden, staring at the withered roses with unblinking eyes. Sometimes she would be found sitting in her late mother's room, in the exact chair she had favored, a book open in her lap as if she were reading, but her gaze looking straight through the pages. Most disturbingly, she was repeatedly found in her father's study, standing in the exact spot where the dolls had been vandalized, reaching out to touch invisible spaces and whispering conversations with people who weren't there. When asked about these nocturnal wanderings, Beatrice would claim to have no memory of leaving her room. She insisted she went to bed in her own bed each night and woke up there each morning with no awareness of the hours that had passed in her fugue state. The servants, already nervous about the strange behavior of both sisters since their mistress's death, began to whisper among themselves about supernatural explanations for Beatrice's condition, that she was being haunted by grief. Nathaniel Cartwright, desperate for some rational solution to his daughter's rapidly deteriorating mental states, began consulting with various physicians in Haverford and neighboring towns. Most dismissed the symptoms as hysteria, a temporary condition brought on by the shock of their mother's death and the confines of upper-class female life. They suggested a trip to Europe, or simply throwing more parties as a distraction. But Dr. Edwin Marrow, when presented with a detailed account of the sisters' conditions by Nathaniel during a fundraiser for the Institute, showed an immediate and intense interest that went far beyond professional empathy. Marrow listened to Nathaniel's story with the focused attention of a researcher who had just found the perfect subjects for his work. He asked probing questions about their specific symptoms, the differences in their dreams, and the psychological connection between the two sisters. What excited Marrow most was the perfect symmetry in Clara and Beatrice's decline. If one was becoming increasingly rational and aggressive, while the other was sinking deeper into an internal world of emotion, they represented a natural experiment on the two extremes of the human mind. This could provide invaluable data on the biological basis of personality. The fact that they were identical twins made them priceless from a research perspective. Any differences in their responses to his therapy could be attributed directly to psychological factors and his interventions, not to physical variations. They were the fertile ground where he could plant and prove his most audacious theories. Marrow arranged a visit to the Cartwright mansion on a chilly October afternoon, ostensibly to examine the sisters and offer medical advice that might help them recover from their emotional trauma. The carriage ride from the Institute took less than an hour, passing along the cobblestone roads leading to the town's wealthiest district. The mansion itself, when Marrow first saw it through the carriage window, looked like a fortress of wealth. The large brick building was surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns, its order and beauty a testament to the Cartwright family's power. What Marrow found when he actually examined the sisters exceeded even his most ambitious expectations. Here were two identical subjects, exhibiting perfectly opposite psychological symptoms, with a clear cause of emotional shock, but no family history of similar pathologies that could complicate the diagnostic picture. During the examination, which lasted nearly 4 hours, he took detailed notes on their reactions. He tested Clara's reflexes, noting the tension in her muscles. He spoke with Beatrice, analyzing every metaphor in her speech. He asked increasingly probing questions about their mental states, their dreams, their fears and memories, especially about the bond between them. More importantly, his trained eye noticed something that Nathaniel Cartwright, in his grief and drunken stupors, had completely missed. Both sisters showed subtle but unmistakable signs of using a laudanum-based sedative, something sometimes prescribed by doctors for female anxiety, but which could cause severe mood changes with long-term use. Beatrice's pupils were slightly dilated, and her responses were unnaturally slow. Clara, in contrast, had an almost excessive alertness, her hand trembling slightly as she held a teacup, suggesting she might have been using some kind of stimulant from her lab to counteract fatigue. Most tellingly, both complained of mild headaches and changes in appetite. When Marrow questioned them carefully about their daily routines and any medications they might have been taking, he discovered that the family doctor had prescribed the same calming tonic for both of them after their mother's death. Clara admitted she had stopped taking it because it made her feel foggy, while Beatrice had continued to take it regularly. This discovery led Marrow to an exhilarating realization. Someone, whether intentionally or not, had already begun a preliminary experiment for him. One had been given a sedative, the other had not. One had turned to a stimulant, the other had not. The divergence in their psychology was not just due to grief, but was being amplified by chemicals. The sisters had been partially prepared for the kind of research Marrow had always dreamed of. The combination of sedatives and stimulants, however accidental, had created a perfect stage for his theories, while the sisters still believed their symptoms were entirely a natural result of grief. This presented an opportunity that the ambitious doctor could not pass up. The sisters were partially prepared for the kind of behavioral research Marrow had always dreamed of conducting. Their minds had become more malleable due to chemical influence. Their personalities were beginning to diverge along predictable lines, and their father was desperate enough to try any therapy that might bring peace to his family. All that remained was to convince Nathaniel Cartwright that the Haverford Institute of Medicine offered the only hope for his daughter's recovery. Dr. Marrow made his formal proposal to Nathaniel Cartwright on a cold November evening as they sat in the opulent drawing room of the mansion while the wind howled through the bare branches outside. The room, with its polished mahogany furniture and ancestral portraits on the walls, smelled of brandy and loneliness. Through the large window, they could see the gaslights of the town flickering in the darkness, creating a desolate backdrop for their conversation. His daughters, Marrow explained in his most professional and empathetic tone, were exhibiting symptoms that made them ideal candidates for a groundbreaking therapeutic program he had been developing for over a year. Their condition, while certainly disturbing, was actually a rare opportunity from a scientific perspective. It allowed for the study of the different ways the human mind reacts to the same shock under controlled conditions. With the proper treatment at the Haverford Institute, using the most advanced neurological techniques available, Marrow believed he could not only heal their psychological wounds but also contribute invaluable knowledge to the rapidly growing field of mental science. Clara and Beatrice would be helping to advance human understanding in ways that could benefit countless others in the future. The therapeutic protocol, Marrow explained with the confidence of someone who had planned every detail, would involve the careful administration of chemical and hypnotic therapies combined with detailed observation and documentation of their responses. Clara and Beatrice would be housed in comfortable private rooms, specifically designed to create a tranquil environment. They would receive the most dedicated medical care and be monitored by trained professionals who understood the complexities of the human mind. The program would last approximately 4 months, during which the sisters would be completely isolated from external stresses that could hinder their recovery. At the end of this period, Marrow promised they would be returned to their family, not only cured of their current symptoms, but also stronger and more self-aware. The experience of participating in an advanced therapy would give them the tools to face life, helping them become resilient and independent women. Nathaniel, desperate to have his daughters back to their former selves and intrigued by the idea that his family's tragedy could contribute to scientific progress, was completely convinced by Marrow's proposal. The doctor's reputation was impressive. His explanations sounded scientific and rational, and the Haverford Institute was known for being at the forefront of new treatments. Moreover, Marrow's explanation that the sisters' identical nature made them invaluable for research appealed to Nathaniel's pride in the Cartwright lineage. Any differences in their responses could be attributed to the therapy itself. The Cartwright sisters would not only be healed, but would also contribute to the legacy of medicine, something greater than personal pain. What Nathaniel didn't know, and what Marrow had no intention of revealing, was that the doctor had seen through to the nature of the sisters' condition and had no interest in healing them. His real goal was to discover how far he could shape the human mind in two opposite directions using systematic chemical and psychological manipulation. Clara and Beatrice represented the perfect test subjects for the most ambitious experiment of his career. Marrow had spent months developing a research protocol that would transform the two sisters into living examples of the extremes of the human mind. Clara, with her natural sharp intellect and strong will, would receive carefully calibrated therapies designed to eliminate empathy and moral barriers, while amplifying her assertiveness and cold logic. Beatrice, with her increasing sensitivity and introspection, would be given therapies intended to create complete psychological passivity, suggestibility, and dependence on external guidance. The goal was not medical treatment, but the creation of two human beings who represented perfect opposites on the cognitive spectrum. One, the embodiment of pure reason, capable of making decisions without the interference of emotion. The other, the embodiment of pure emotion, incapable of self-protection or independent thought. If successful, the experiment would prove Marrow's theories on the biological basis of personality and provide him with research data that would establish his reputation as the foremost expert in mental science. The two sisters arrived at the Haverford Institute of Medicine on a bleak December morning, accompanied by their father and a maid. The ride from the mansion was short, but the silence in the carriage was heavy. By the time they reached the institute, both Clara and Beatrice looked tired and somewhat lost. The Gothic building of the Haverford Institute was designed to impress with its solemnity and reliability. Its stained glass windows and high-ceilinged corridors evoked a sense of a sanctuary where science and healing merged. The institute's reputation for pioneering neurological treatments promised that patients would receive the best care, second to none. Private rooms on the second floor of the West Wing had been specially designed for long-term patient observation, with features that allowed medical staff to monitor them without disturbing their privacy. Clara was assigned to room 212, a bright room overlooking the institute's garden. Beatrice received room 214, identical in layout, but with a window facing the dense forest behind. Dr. Marrow's office occupied room 213, conveniently located between his two research subjects, where he could supervise both of them at all times. From the moment the sisters entered their rooms, Marrow began implementing strict protocols. He explained to them and their father that for the therapy to be maximally effective, they needed to be completely isolated from each other. Interaction between them, he argued, could create emotional interference, hindering the individual treatment process. Separation was necessary for success, Marrow insisted, and any contact between Clara and Beatrice in the coming months could undo the progress that had been made. Their meals would be prepared separately according to personalized menus. Their daily schedules would be carefully structured to meet their specific therapeutic needs, and their access to visitors, reading materials, and even information about each other would be tightly controlled to prevent negative influences from complicating their recovery. Nathaniel Cartwright, reassured by Marrow's professional demeanor and detailed explanations, agreed to all restrictions without question. He left his two daughters in what he believed were the best hands, promising to return in 4 months to take them home, fully recovered. As his carriage rolled away from the Institute's grounds, Clara and Beatrice Cartwright began their final journey into a hell disguised as medical therapy. Within the first few weeks of treatment at the Haverford Institute, the divergence between Clara and Beatrice became so pronounced that even the most inexperienced nurses could see something unusual was happening in rooms 212 and 214. The transformation was too rapid and too extreme to be explained by any conventional therapy. Yet, Dr. Marrow's daily reports to the board of directors described only steady progress toward psychological balance for both patients. Clara's angry outbursts, which had been merely sharp words at home, escalated into destructive behavior. During therapy sessions, she would argue with doctors with such cold, harsh logic that they were left flustered. She tore apart books she deemed tedious and once smashed a tea set because it interrupted her train of thought. Her already formidable willpower seemed to be amplified, as if the therapies were sharpening her intellect along with her impatience. Her speech became concise, precise, and often brutally analytical. She would describe complex plans to reorganize the entire institute's operations, pointing out weaknesses in management and personnel with the cool interest of a strategist studying a map. Most disturbingly, Clara began to claim she could see the logic behind others' emotions. She would stare at nurses and staff, then point out their exact fears or hidden motives, as if she were reading an analytical report on them. These observations were often frighteningly accurate. She correctly identified a nurse's financial worries, a young doctor's ambition for promotion, and the hidden grief of an old gatekeeper. Despite having no way of knowing this information, she analyzed it coolly. Beatrice's transformation moved in the opposite direction, with equal speed and intensity. Within days of starting treatment, she became completely compliant with any instruction, no matter how absurd. When doctors asked her to sit motionless for hours for observation or to copy nonsensical passages, she would comply immediately and without any emotional reaction. Her speech slowed to a barely audible whisper, and the content of her conversations became increasingly vague, filled with poetic but meaningless imagery. She would answer questions about her condition by describing the color of an emotion or the sound of a memory, all delivered in a flat, ethereal tone. Most unsettling to the nurses was Beatrice's habit of looking directly into people's eyes with an unblinking gaze that seemed to look through them rather than at them. Unlike her sister's analytical stare, Beatrice's expression was completely vacant, as if the person behind her eyes had dissolved, leaving only a beautiful body that could respond to external stimuli but could not generate independent thought or emotion. Dr. Marrow documented every detail of their deterioration with the precision of a scientist. His daily notes, written in a system of symbols he had developed himself, recorded their reactions to various therapies, chemical, hypnotic, along with changes in behavior, sleep patterns, and his own theories about the ongoing neurological mechanisms. The substances Marrow was using went far beyond anything considered legitimate therapy. Clara received carefully calculated doses of strychnine, combined with experimental stimulants that Marrow had obtained through correspondence with chemists in Europe. The goal was to suppress the brain's emotional centers while enhancing the areas responsible for logic and analysis. Beatrice's therapy involved different but equally dangerous substances. Her hypnosis sessions were combined with the use of ether to induce a dreamlike state, along with experimental sedatives designed to weaken the ability to form independent will. Marrow believed this would make her completely dependent on external guidance for even the most basic decisions. The objective was to reduce Beatrice to a state of complete emotional dependency, where she would be incapable of logical thought or resistance to any psychological influence. Other medical staff at the institute began to express serious concerns about Marrow's methods as the sisters' conditions became impossible to hide. Dr. Alistair Finch, an older physician and a friend of the Cartwright family, noticed that Marrow was using therapies not recognized in any mainstream medical protocol. When Dr. Finch tried to review Marrow's treatment records and notes, he was told the information was highly confidential and that outside interference could disrupt the fragile balance of the sisters' recovery. Nurse Margaret Maggie Poole, a young, dedicated, and perceptive woman, had been assigned to the daily care of both patients. What she witnessed during her shifts left her haunted and convinced that something terrible was being disguised as medical progress. She began keeping a private journal about the sisters' conditions, documenting changes she believed no legitimate therapy could produce. According to her notes, Clara had begun to map out detailed plans to optimize the institute's operations, describing methods of staff control and discipline with a cold logic and technical precision that showed a deep understanding of human psychology. She would explain exactly how to exploit a person's weakness to force compliance, how to create competition to increase productivity, and how to maintain absolute power through information. These discussions were presented in a calm, objective tone that made them infinitely more frightening than her previous rages. Meanwhile, Beatrice had become so passive that she would not eat, drink, or even change her sitting position unless specifically instructed. Nurse Maggie discovered she could arrange Beatrice's limbs in any position, and she would remain that way for hours, like a living doll placed by an artist. Her responses to questions became increasingly delayed, as if the words had to travel through a vast ocean of emotion in her mind before they could form an answer. The most disturbing aspect of Beatrice's condition was the complete loss of her sense of self-preservation. When she accidentally spilled hot tea on her hand during one of Maggie's visits, she showed no reaction to the pain and made no attempt to pull her hand away. When her blood was drawn for testing, she would watch the blood flow from the needle prick with a distant curiosity, but with no awareness that the body being injured was her own. Nurse Maggie's concerns about Marrow's methods reached a crisis point one evening in late November when she chanced upon Dr. Marrow preparing a therapy for the sisters that was clearly not ordinary medicine. Through a cracked open door, Maggie saw Marrow mixing two different solutions. One was a pale amber color, likely a strong plant extract. The other was clear, but when Marrow added a drop of another liquid, it fizzed slightly. When Maggie confronted Marrow directly about these observations the next day, asking about the nature of the new tonics, Marrow simply smiled and claimed his methods were based on advanced neurological research from France and Germany, things American medicine was too conservative to accept. The therapies might seem unorthodox, he explained, but they were producing breakthrough results that would completely change how we understand the human mind. Maggie's suspicions deepened when she was cleaning Marrow's office and found scraps of correspondence with doctors in Europe who were notorious for research that violated basic medical ethics. The letters, written in French and German, seemed to describe in detail the progress of the C and B subjects, and mentioned publishing a paper on what they euphemistically called deliberate psychological disassociation. Just as Maggie was gathering the courage to share her concerns with Dr. Finch and possibly the journalist Samuel Reed, tragedy struck. Beatrice Cartwright disappeared from her room on the night of the 28th of November, 1873. The circumstances of her disappearance were immediately suspicious to anyone who understood Beatrice's true mental state. Her door was found unlocked the next morning, despite strict rules that rooms in this section be locked at night. Her bed was neat, as if it had never been slept in, but her personal belongings were untouched. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Most puzzling of all, Beatrice had left the institute when she had been completely incapable of walking or acting independently for weeks. Dr. Marrow's explanation for the disappearance raised more questions than it answered. He claimed that Beatrice had had a sudden emotional awakening. He suggested she had felt homesick and had perhaps tried to walk back to her family's mansion, even though the mansion was nearly a mile away, and Beatrice had been incapable of making her own decisions for months. Or, he suggested smugly, his therapy had been more successful than anyone realized, and Beatrice had recovered enough will to plan and execute an escape. A search of the institute building and surrounding area revealed no trace of Beatrice, though several night staff reported hearing strange sounds coming from the basement area where old equipment was stored. The sound of clinking glass, muffled whispers, and what might have been faint, intermittent music. When the area was checked, nothing unusual was found, though some noted that one of the storage rooms seemed suspiciously clean and tidy, inconsistent with its usual dusty, neglected state. Clara's reaction to the news of her sister's disappearance was immediate and more terrifying than anything she had displayed during her months of treatment. When told that Beatrice was missing, she fell into a cold silence that lasted for nearly an hour. She just sat on her bed, staring at the wall, her eyes unblinking, her mind seeming to calculate something at a phenomenal speed. Then, suddenly, she began to speak, not screaming, but a cold, logical monologue that lasted for hours. She analyzed every possible scenario that could have befallen Beatrice, laid out detailed plans to search for her, and made scalpel-sharp accusations against every staff member in the institute, pointing out their flaws and motives with terrifying clarity. This intellectual explosion was different from her previous rages in both its intensity and its cruelty. Clara seemed to possess a superhuman analytical ability, connecting events and possibilities with an irrefutable logic. Her accusations were not random anger, but carefully deduced conclusions about how the institute had failed to protect her sister and how she would hold each person accountable. When the monologue finally ended, Clara fell silent again, then asked calmly, "When can I see my sister?" Her voice was perfectly normal, as if the hours of cold analysis had never happened. The rapid transition between extreme intellectual intensity and apparent calm convinced Maggie that Clara was not recovering, but had been deliberately transformed into something beyond human. The truth about Beatrice's disappearance was revealed that very night when Nurse Maggie, unable to sleep, made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Driven by her suspicions and the strange noises she had also heard, she took an oil lamp and went down to the basement herself. She noticed a sweet, chemical smell, like ether, coming from the suspiciously clean storage room. The door was only loosely latched. When Maggie pushed the door open, she found the body of Beatrice Cartwright. She wasn't lying on the floor, but was seated neatly in an old surgical chair, with such care and precision that it was obvious this was not the result of an accident or suicide. It was a deliberate arrangement. Beatrice's body had been arranged in a morbid parody of a reading session, her hands placed gently on an open book of poetry in her lap. Her nightgown was smoothed perfectly, as if she had simply fallen asleep and might wake at any moment. Most disturbingly, her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, not held by metal clips, but by an unnatural emptiness, creating the illusion that she was still there, observing her surroundings with a strange serenity. Maggie, though horrified, had enough presence of mind as a nurse to realize that Beatrice had been dead for some time. This meant she had been killed on the very night she was said to have disappeared. The cause of death was not immediately obvious, with no signs of trauma. but on her arm there was a tiny, almost invisible needle mark. Most horrifyingly, when Maggie gently touched Beatrice's hair, she felt a difference at the back of her head. A section of hair had been skillfully cut away, and underneath it, she could feel a sutured incision that had been expertly stitched. Dr. Marrow, when confronted with this discovery by Maggie and Dr. Finch the next morning, offered an explanation that was transparently false to anyone with medical knowledge. Beatrice had suffered a sudden cardiac failure during the night, Marrow claimed, and had passed away despite his best efforts to save her. He had moved the body to the basement to conduct a discreet post-mortem to avoid causing a panic, and was preparing his report when the body was discovered. The incision at the back of her head, according to Marrow's account, was part of a standard post-mortem procedure to examine the brain in order to determine the precise cause of the heart failure. He produced hastily written notes, supposedly documenting Beatrice's final hours, but the handwriting seemed rushed, and the medical details were inconsistent with a typical case of cardiac arrest. But Nurse Maggie had kept her own careful journal on the sisters' conditions, and her observations contradicted every aspect of Marrow's explanation. Beatrice had shown no signs of heart disease during her time at the Institute. Quite the opposite, her physical health was excellent. More importantly, Maggie had personally checked on Beatrice just hours before she supposedly died and had found her in her usual passive state, showing no signs of distress or medical emergency. Most damningly, Maggie had witnessed Dr. Marrow walking toward Beatrice's wing late on the night of her disappearance. He wasn't carrying his usual medical bag, but a small wooden box, the kind he used to store his delicate surgical instruments and vials of experimental chemicals. She had assumed it was for a late-night therapy session, but now the timing seemed too coincidental to be innocent. When Dr. Finch and the Institute's board demanded to see Marrow's complete treatment records for both sisters, hoping to understand why Beatrice's condition had ended so tragically, they discovered that most of the documents had vanished. What remained were loose pages of notes, written in Marrow's system of symbols, but a few sections, which Maggie remembered the symbols for, could be roughly deciphered. They painted a picture of systematic psychological manipulation disguised as therapy, references to personality shaping through neurological intervention and exploring the limits of mental plasticity, suggested experiments that went far beyond any accepted form of treatment. Detailed charts tracked the sisters' responses to hypnotic therapies and various chemical substances, with notes about increasing stimulation or minimizing will to push their psychological states to two predetermined, opposing poles. Most chilling were Marrow's theoretical writings on the possibility of creating perfect prototypes of human mental types through careful manipulation of the brain. He had clearly viewed Clara and Beatrice not as patients to be healed, but as research subjects to be molded until they achieved the psychological characteristics he wanted to prove. Clara's final breakdown began when Maggie, with Dr. Finch's permission, informed her of Beatrice's death. Maggie had insisted on delivering the news herself, not allowing Marrow the chance to manipulate Clara's reaction. Clara's initial reaction was complete silence. She stared at her own hands for nearly an hour without speaking or moving, as if her mind were trying to process an impossible equation. Then, suddenly and without warning, she began to laugh. A cold, emotionless laugh that quickly became more frightening than any of her previous rages. The laughter continued, interrupted only by moments when she would murmur complex chemical formulas and nonsensical phrases about the puppet strings being cut and the doctor's perfect experiment. The nurses could hear her voice echoing down the hall, and a sense of dread spread through the wing. In her few brief moments of lucidity, Clara told Maggie things that would haunt her forever. She claimed Dr. Marrow had been giving them tonics that change your thoughts from the inside, and that the therapies had been specifically designed to turn one of us into pure reason and the other into pure emotion. She described feeling her own empathy gradually disappear as the therapies took effect, feeling herself becoming a cold, logical machine that she couldn't control or understand. Most disturbingly, Clara revealed details about Marrow's methods that had never been officially documented. She described how, under hypnosis, Marrow had shown her images of Beatrice becoming increasingly passive and vague, She claimed that Marrow had been documenting their reactions to perceiving each other's changes as part of his research into the psychological bond between twins. According to Clara, the experiments had been designed not just to modify individual behavior, but to study how the degradation of one would affect the mental state of the other. Marrow had deliberately pushed Beatrice into a state of passivity while observing how Clara's awareness of her sister's dissolution would affect the development of her own cold logic. This revelation suggested that both sisters had been conscious victims of the therapy, not passive subjects, and that their final psychological states were the intended results of months of systematic manipulation rather than unexpected side effects. After this horrifying revelation, Clara fell into a state of complete silence. She would not eat, drink, and refused all care. She just sat on her bed, looking out the window, as if waiting for something. Maggie, with the help of the journalist Samuel Reed, whom she had contacted, arranged to get Clara out of the institute secretly that night. They feared Marrow would harm her to silence her, but it was too late. When they entered her room, they found Clara dead. She was sitting calmly in her chair, holding a small, empty vial of a chemical from the lab that she had managed to hide. The official cause of death was listed by the institute as suicide due to nervous prostration, but Maggie knew the truth. It was a final act of will, a logical choice to escape an experiment she could no longer control. Her last words, scrawled on a piece of paper left for Maggie, were, "Tell them what he tried to create. Tell them we were people, not machines. Tell them the puppet strings were cut because the master cut them." Dr. Edwin Marrow vanished from Haverford exactly 24 hours after Clara's death, leaving only a brief letter of resignation, claiming he had received a sudden research offer in Europe that required his immediate attention. When the Institute's board, under pressure from Nathaniel Cartwright and Samuel Reed's impending article, tried to investigate him, they discovered that no record of his prestigious credentials in Boston could be independently verified. The hospital where he claimed to have previously worked only confirmed a brief period of employment, and the research offer in Europe turned out to be entirely fictitious. Marrow had vanished into thin air, like a ghost. More disturbingly, articles Samuel Reed found in old archives revealed that several asylums in New England had reported unexplainable cases of miraculous recoveries or sudden breakdowns in patients during periods when a young doctor matching Marrow's description had been on staff. A thorough search of Marrow's office and lab, conducted before a mysterious fire broke out, revealed the true scope of his activities. Samuel Reed managed to grab a notebook just before everything was consumed by the flames. Hidden in a secret compartment of the desk, it contained detailed notes describing months of psychological and chemical manipulation designed to transform the Cartwright sisters into what he called perfect prototypes of cognitive types. The notebook, written in a complex system of symbols, was partially deciphered with Maggie's help. It revealed that Clara had been given carefully calculated combinations of strychnine and other experimental stimulants, designed to suppress the emotional centers and enhance logical capacity to an extreme degree. The goal was to create a human being capable of unlimited reasoning without being bound by morality or affection. Beatrice's therapy had involved the use of ether and deep hypnosis, combined with sedative compounds intended to destroy independent thought and create complete dependence on external emotional stimuli. The goal was to bring her to a state where she could not function without constant guidance. Most chillingly, the notebook revealed that the Cartwright sisters were not Marrow's first subjects. References to Case A and Case B suggested he had been conducting similar experiments for years, using vulnerable patients from various institutions. The two sisters were just his most ambitious attempt to prove that human personality could be completely restructured, but they were part of a pattern of systematic abuse that had been disguised as legitimate medical research. The notebook also contained detailed observations on the psychological effects of letting one twin perceive the changes in the other, suggesting that Marrow was studying not just individual responses, but also the deep psychological bond between them. He had deliberately let Clara know about Beatrice's deteriorating condition, using her concern as a tool to enhance her focus on logic and eliminate her own emotions. The Institute's board, faced with the undeniable evidence from the notebook and pressure from Samuel's article, confronted an impossible choice that would determine the future of the Haverford Institute and the reputations of the town's most powerful families. They could expose Marrow's crimes and publish the notebook, which would bring belated justice to the Cartwright sisters, but could also completely destroy the reputation of the Haverford Institute and tarnish the names of its founding families. Or they could bury the evidence, blame a single rogue doctor, and hope that such horrors would never be repeated, protecting their legacy and ensuring the full truth would never be known. After several closed-door meetings with Nathaniel Cartwright and other influential town leaders, they chose a compromise, a controlled silence. Samuel Reed's article was allowed to be published, but it was heavily edited, focusing only on the abuse of authority by a single doctor and avoiding any mention of the Institute's complicity. Marrow's notebook was declared to have been completely destroyed in the fire. The basement room where Beatrice's body was discovered was permanently sealed, with official records stating that structural damage made it unsafe. Staff members who had witnessed aspects of the experiment were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, promising never to discuss what they had observed, with violations punishable by termination and lawsuits from the powerful Cartwright family. Nurse Maggie Poole refused to sign and left Haverford immediately, taking her painful memories and her own copy of her notes with her. She moved out west, hoping to leave the past behind. Nathaniel Cartwright, tormented by guilt, withdrew from society, living out the rest of his life in solitude and regret. He never spoke of the true circumstances of his daughter's deaths. To the public, the story was told that the two sisters, in their grief, had taken their own lives together, but the silence imposed by the Institute could not completely extinguish the horror of what had happened in rooms 212 and 214. Maggie, before she left, entrusted a copy of her journal to Samuel Reed, who kept it carefully. Dr. Finch, haunted by his failure to protect his friend's daughters, wrote coded notes about the case in his medical journals, which were discovered years after his death. And the whispers of the staff created a dark legend, a story told in the shadows about the twin sisters and the doctor who tried to play God. The workers who cleaned up after the fire whispered to each other about the strange instruments and acrid-smelling chemical vials they found in the ashes of the lab. The nurses who had cared for Clara and Beatrice told their families about the frightening transformation of the two sisters, one becoming as cold as a machine, the other dissolving like smoke. Over the years, these whispers would occasionally surface in the clubs of the New England elite, always quickly suppressed, but never entirely forgotten. The case of the Cartwright sisters became a cautionary tale, shared quietly among doctors concerned with the ethical boundaries of medicine, a reminder of what can happen when scientific ambition is not tempered by compassion. The story took on more layers of complexity as former Institute staff shared fragments of information with others. Each telling added new details or emphasized different aspects of the case until it became difficult to separate verified facts from speculation and legend. Some versions focused on Marrow's hypnotic methods, others on the sisters' psychological decline, and still others on the institutional cover-up that prevented justice from being served. By the early 20th century, the case had become part of the informal oral history of New England medicine, referenced in private conversations whenever doctors discussed the importance of ethical oversight and the dangers of unregulated human experimentation. Hospitals began to develop stricter protocols for approving new treatments, though these changes were implemented quietly, without explicit reference to the Cartwright case. Today, nearly 150 years after Clara and Beatrice Cartwright died, the Haverford Institute no longer exists. The old Gothic building has been converted into part of a private university. The building where they suffered and died continues to be a place of learning, though the rooms on the second floor of the West Wing, where they spent their final months, have been converted into storage offices that few are permitted to enter. Maggie Poole's journal and Samuel Reed's notes are believed to still exist, stored away somewhere, a collection of fragments of a terrible truth, waiting for a researcher brave enough to piece them together. The few historians who have tried to trace the case report that many crucial documents seem to have been burned in the fire or lost mysteriously, leaving only fragments that raise more questions than answers. The basement room where Beatrice's body was discovered has never been reopened. Despite numerous renovation projects that have updated other parts of the building, construction workers who have worked in adjacent areas report strange sounds coming from the sealed-off section. The sound of tinkling glass, muffled whispers that could be from old ventilation systems, and occasionally, some have heard faint, sad music echoing through the walls. Security guards who work the night shift in the old Institute building have reported unusual incidents that they are instructed not to discuss with anyone outside the university administration. Doors found ajar despite being locked the previous evening. Lights in the old corridors turning on and off in patterns that don't correspond to any electrical system. Most disturbingly are the reports from students and faculty who claim to have seen figures in the corridors of the West Wing during late-night study sessions. Two identical women in 19th century dress, one gliding past with a determined air, the other seeming to float with an infinite sadness. They only appear fleetingly in peripheral vision but vanish when observed directly. These sightings are always dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations, but they occur with enough frequency that many now avoid working alone in that part of the building after dark. The Cartwright family mansion still stands, though it has changed owners several times since Nathaniel passed away in solitude. The current owners, a law firm, are unaware of the connection between their property and the tragedy at the Haverford Institute. The plot of land where the sisters' graves once were has been sold and built over, with no trace remaining. Local historians have occasionally tried to research the Cartwright family, but they consistently run into obstacles that suggest someone is still trying to keep certain information from becoming public. Business records from the 1,870 are suspiciously missing. Local newspaper archives have strange gaps, and family documents that could shed light on the case appear to have been systematically removed from libraries and historical societies. The most persistent researcher, Professor Evelyn Reed, the granddaughter of the journalist Samuel Reed, has spent her career trying to piece together the full story of the Cartwright sisters, using the notes her grandfather left her. In her 2022 book, she noted that the level of information suppression suggests the complicity of multiple powerful families, a silence that has been maintained for generations. This implies that whatever happened to Clara and Beatrice Cartwright was significant enough that the descendants of those in power still consider it worth hiding. What do you think of this story? Do you believe experiments like Dr. Marrow's could have really happened in 1873, when medical regulations were nascent and patients' rights were virtually non-existent? The techniques Dr. Marrow allegedly used, hypnosis, ether, and chemical compounds, were theoretically quite possible with the neurological and chemical knowledge of the late 19th century, and the institutional cover-up reflects patterns we know occurred in many real historical cases of medical abuse. Leave your comment below about whether you think the Cartwright sisters were real victims of a medical experiment, or if this is the kind of horror story that grows out of legitimate historical fears about unchecked science. Do you believe that evidence of such cases might still be hidden in medical archives across the country, waiting to be discovered by researchers brave enough to ask the right questions? If you found this investigation as disturbing and compelling as we did, subscribe to our channel to never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical secrets. Hit that notification bell so you'll know immediately when we release new content. And share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that make you question what really happened in our past. The truth about human experimentation in medical history is always more horrifying than fiction. And sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that institutions refuse to acknowledge ever happened. Remember, the line between historical fact and historical fiction can be surprisingly thin, especially when powerful institutions have reasons to keep certain truths buried. The Cartwright sisters may be gone, but their story serves as a reminder that the price of scientific progress has sometimes been paid by people who never consented to become part of history's darkest experiments.